You're about to watch the last seconds of Comair Flight 5191. As the plane is on the takeoff run, no one on board is aware of what is about to happen. Out of the darkness, the end of the runway suddenly appears in sight. Desperately, the pilot tries to get the plane off the ground, but all his efforts are in vain.
Go ahead.
This is Lexington. Alert 3, west side of the runway. It was a Comair regional jet taking off.
Alert 3, west side of runway?
Yeah, west side of the airport. Just off the approaching runway 8.
Off the approaching runway 8?
Yeah.
Runway 8?
Off the approaching runway 8. He was taking off 2-2.
Off the approaching runway 8?
Yeah, he's off the west side of the runway.
West side of the runway, alrighty.
Yeah.
Out of the 50 people on board, only one person survived. The pilot who was flying. Let's rewind and try to understand what happened. Comair Flight 5191 was a scheduled regional flight between Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky, and Atlanta International Airport in Georgia. The meteorological conditions were particularly favorable. Night visual conditions prevailed, with 8-mile visibility, a few scattered clouds, and a wind speed of 7 knots. The aircraft was a Bombardier CRJ-100, a common regional jet in North America that is manufactured in Canada. It was configured with 50 passenger seats, a jump seat for the flight attendant, and 2 cockpit seats for the flight crew. The captain was an experienced pilot with more than 4,700 total flight hours, including more than 3,000 in the CRJ-100. He was flying for the first time with the first officer, an equally experienced pilot with more than 6,500 total flight hours, out of which 3,500 were in this aircraft model. Interviews with their colleagues showed that both pilots were very competent and proficient. Some of them even stated that the first officer was a thorough, by-the-book pilot. The flight crew checked in at Bluegrass Airport at 5:15 a.m. Even though it was early in the morning, no one who was in contact with the crew noticed any signs of tiredness. The ATC tower was staffed with only one controller, responsible for all tower and radar positions. When the CVR began recording the sounds in the cockpit, the crew was performing the standard pre-flight procedures. They tuned in to the Automated Terminal Information Service, which indicated that runway 22 was in use. A minute later, the controller cleared them for their flight plan to Atlanta Airport, and the first officer acknowledged the clearance. The captain offered the first officer to take over the controls once they were aligned with the runway. He accepted, and soon they began the takeoff briefing. During this briefing, the first officer asked the captain about the runway they would be using, to which the captain replied, "It's 22." The first officer continued the takeoff briefing, which included 3 additional references to this runway. In one of them, he stated that the runway and identifier lights were out, and he mentioned that as he came in the other night, it was like lights were out all over the place. Then he stated that runway 22 is a short taxi via taxiway Alpha. Before starting the engines, the first officer briefed the takeoff decision speed V1 as 137 knots and the rotation speed VR as 142 knots. The plane was now ready for pushback, and the flight data recorder showed that the flight crew started up the engines at 6 a.m. Additionally, it showed that the heading bugs were set to 227 degrees, which corresponded to the heading of runway 22. A minute later, the first officer notified the controller that they were ready to taxi. The controller cleared them to taxi and instructed them to cross runway 26 without stopping. This was a short runway used only by general aviation flights. Its length was less than half of runway 22, and it was less than the length required for a CRJ-100 to get off the ground. The first officer responded taxi 22, and the captain called for the taxi checklist. As they were rolling down the taxiway, the flight crew had a brief, casual conversation that lasted around 40 seconds. Between engine startup and below 10,000 feet, the sterile cockpit environment rules are in place. These rules prohibit pilots from engaging in any conversation that is not relevant to the flight. Back in the cockpit, the first officer began the before takeoff checklist, mentioning again runway 22. At 4 minutes past 6, they reached the hold short line of runway 26, and the first officer advised the controller that they were ready to depart. The captain aligned the airplane with what he believed was runway 22. In reality, they were aligned with runway 26. He then gave the controls to the first officer. He advanced the throttles to the takeoff power set, and the airplane began its last ever takeoff run. The controller heard a loud noise and immediately noticed a fire west of the airport. A public safety officer and a police officer were the first to arrive at the crash site, some 8 minutes after the impact. By this time, most of the plane was consumed by the fire, except for the cockpit, which detached from the fuselage after the impact. They searched inside and found only the first officer. The captain's seat was ripped off during the impact and thrown into the passenger cabin along with the pilot. The first officer was unconscious and severely injured, but he was still alive. One of the security officers used his own vehicle to transport him to the hospital rather than waiting for an ambulance. This might have been the ultimate action that saved his life. Unfortunately, the remaining 49 people on board didn't make it. Most of them were victims of the airplane's impact with the trees or the post-fire initiated after the aircraft came to a full stop. The media blamed the pilots for breaking the sterile cockpit environment rule during the taxi. However, little did they know this was only a small piece of the bigger picture. Many pilots willingly admit to break the sterile cockpit environment rule. However, this happens mostly during the taxi, when the workload is reduced. Therefore, blaming the pilots on the short conversation they had during the taxi is a shallow way to understand what really happened. The bigger picture includes human factors as a key role in this accident. 10 months after the unfortunate event, the final report was released by the NTSB. With the final report at hand, let's try to understand what happened. First, why did the crew align with the wrong runway? At the time of the accident, Bluegrass Airport was nearing the completion of a construction project. The idea was to shift runway 422 some 300 feet to the southwest in order to accommodate a longer runway safety area at the approach end of runway 22. This would imply the demolition of the old taxiway Alpha, which was temporarily replaced by taxiway Alpha 5 until the construction of the final taxiway Alpha 7 was completed. During the takeoff briefing, the flight crew was expecting a short and simple taxi to runway 22. When the crew consulted the airport charts and tuned in to the 80s, there was no indication to tell them that taxiway Alpha was closed due to construction works. The 80s mentioned that runway 22 was in use, something both pilots already knew. Additionally, the route from the hold short line to the runway was very similar for both runways. Each of them involved a sharp left turn in order to align with the runway. So, why did they stop at the hold short line of runway 26 and not at the hold short line of runway 22? After starting up the engines, the controller instructed the crew to proceed to runway 22 by crossing runway 26 without stopping. To understand why the crew stopped at runway 26, we have to jump 6 months after the accident, when the crew of a Learjet 45 encountered a similar situation. The business jet entered runway 26, but couldn't see the lights of the taxiway towards runway 22 until they were at the center line of runway 26. This time, the controller noticed the position of the airplane and contacted them on time, even though the crew said that they knew they were on runway 26 and didn't line up with this runway. There is a high chance that the crew of Comair Flight 5191 didn't see the lights of the taxiway towards runway 22 from the hold short line of runway 26. Another factor was the lighting of the runway's edge. During a taxi demonstration, the investigators noticed the lights on the right side of runway 22 were dimmer than on the left side. Additionally, many pilots, including the first officer on the night before the flight, noticed that many of the lights on runway 22 were out before the accident happened. Therefore, when the crew was rolling down the dark runway 26, they weren't excessively alarmed by the lack of lighting, as they already expected the situation to some degree. Now, how is it possible that the controller didn't see the aircraft rolling down the wrong runway? After clearing Flight 5191 for takeoff, the controller had to perform the traffic count before the end of the shift. He decided to prioritize this task over monitoring the takeoff run, so his eyes were not observing the path of the airplane. Additionally, he was alone during the shift. If another controller was present in the tower, monitoring the takeoff run, the outcome might have been different. After this tragic accident, the NTSB released several safety recommendations. Among them, they prohibited ATC controllers to clear an aircraft to take off until that plane has crossed all intersecting runways. Now, flight crews must confirm and cross-check the airplane's location before crossing the hold short line for takeoff. Additionally, the new recommendations prohibited controllers from performing administrative tasks while moving aircraft are present in the controller's area of responsibility. The first officer who survived the accident with severe injuries could not remember the events. Unfortunately, the media placed him in a bad position and the NTSB concluded in the final report that the probable cause of the accident was pilot error. Not only he had to deal with the severe injuries from the accident, but also with the burden of feeling responsible for the events. I have to emphasize that mistakes never happen in a vacuum. This accident happened due to a sequence of unfortunate events, and it clearly shows how each of us is susceptible to human factors that can lead to such a tragic event. See you next time.